Okay, let's talk briefly about the Florentine Codex. There are a lot of different names for this period that we have spoken about. It is by some called the Renaissance for Europe, which is the rebirth of ancient texts and a reevaluation of ancient culture in the modern era and a reintegration with them. It is sometimes also called the early modern era, which opens it up beyond the rather narrow cultural European tinge to that. It is sometimes called the Age of Humanism because of the traditions of humanism and the focus on human knowledge as opposed to theology and things of the afterlife. As you narrow that down a little further and you get into in Western Europe, you look at the tradition coming out of Spain, you get the era is called the Spanish Golden Age, the Siglo de Oro, generally aligned with the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen, beginning in 1492 and then extending for roughly 60 or 70 years thereafter. Within that, however, you also get what is generally called the Age of Exploration, or some people will call it the Age of Exploitation, which is when the European powers, flush with the ability to actually build ships that can withstand weather, and that new handy-dandy little thing called the compass lets them go across the Atlantic Ocean. And you get famously Christopher Columbus in 1492, and a number of figures that follow: Amerigo Vespucci, Hernando Cortez, Vasco da Gama, Magellan. All of these guys just start fanning out across the globe and essentially conquering the people that they found when they landed, generally looking for, primarily gold. They were out for money. The roots or the ability to find money in Europe were getting a little bit thin as Europe was developing. So they had to go outward for natural resources in general, and everybody liked the shiny metal. So they started heading overseas for it. And the Spanish were particularly good at this. The era of Ferdinand and Isabella was the era of the Spanish Armada. Their navy was the best in the world, quite frankly. And so they could go places. And when they got there, they could do an awful lot of damage in trying to get money. We saw some of this when we looked at Montaigne for last week, when he brought together that Age of Exploration impulse along with the humanist impulse of ethnography, would be the term, but it's really about comparative anthropology. Going and looking and not just finding, or not just looking for the gold that you find across the ocean, but seeing, well, what are the people like? What do they do? How do they organize their societies? How do they do anything? How do they dress? How do they start a fire? What do they eat? Those questions were points of great fascination for Europeans. And Montaigne started to key in on that in his one essay of Cannibals, where he addressed a number of legends about and suspicions about people of the New World, and the European perspective on that. There was a pet industry going on throughout Europe of learning about this, and these expeditions would go over to the Americas, and they would come back eventually, and generally speaking, they would make a lot of money on the back end, no matter what gold or natural resources they were able to dig up while they were over there. They would make a fairly decent bonus when they got home if they could tell a good story and say, yeah, you know what those people are really like. And these publications, these are travel narratives essentially, would be gobbled up by people. They would want to hear it because, it's just, wow, that sounds really cool. Those people are weird. They do things different than we do. Why? The way we do things is pretty damn good, right? I would say that it's the best ever. We are the best ever because we invented that compass and we were able to sail over there. If they were the best ever, why couldn't they sail over here? So we are the best ever. But still, let's just look at them and say, well, how do they do things? Isn't that adorable how they do those things? Isn't that adorable how they dress? Isn't that adorable how they eat? But you can see that condescension seeping in there. You can see that perspective, that bigotry, that snideness in what they do. So these texts come to us through this very problematic, is the word, relationship. We have honest efforts to figure out and record how people are behaving. But how people behave is often affected by who is recording the behavior. Either it changes the perspective or it changes the action and behavior of the people being watched, or the natural prejudices of the people recording it start to seep in. And this is a natural consequence of any kind of academic study. So the texts that we get from this tradition are troubling, but they're still something. They're what we have to deal with. And as long as we stay alert to what they might be suggesting here and there, or what complications there might be in the reading of it, or what biases might be baked into each one of these, you can start to derive some value if you allow for all that. And my argument is always, by practicing the skill of picking through something and saying, well, yeah, that's just him being a jerk, and that's kind of pointless, but look at this underneath there. That's where you start to really refine your thinking. That's where you start to really get something useful out of it. And the Florentine Codex, as it is called, is one of the more interesting ones. The name of it is a little off-putting. The original title was La Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España. I apologize for my accent. It is one manuscript copy that we have of the original document. There are several, but it's really the best preserved one that we go with and that has been standardized. It was written or transcribed, think about the difference between those two things, by a Franciscan monk named Bernardino de Sahagún. He was working through the Colegio de Santa Cruz in Mexico City. He had students helping him collect all of these stories and all of these various chunks of documents that he could find, a lot of it oral, a lot of it pictographic. And he was able to assemble this document, which lays out in fairly exhaustive terms. I think the total work is around 2,400 pages. It's got around 2,000 illustrations. It is written in parallel, where you see the original Nahuatl language on one side and the other a rough Spanish translation. But even the Nahuatl is written in Roman letters, because the Nahuatl did not have a written language that we know of. So there was already sort of an overlay. So think about this. This is a Spanish monk, a Franciscan friar, who is coming to this task with all of his Spanish identity. He is also, very obviously, as a Franciscan friar, a fairly committed Christian. And he's coming to this job with that set of beliefs and interpreting these native and indigenous cultures that way. How much he wrote itself is a little bit uncertain. How much he just transcribed from other sources is uncertain. His the process of writing took decades. He started it around, I think, 1545. He continued to organize his materials until his death, like 40 years later. The essential version of the document as we have it, as the Florentine Codex, which is just the version that happens to be kept. A codex is a form of a book, and it's kept in a library in Florence. That was essentially standardized by around 1569. The elements that we have here are of the conquest of the Spanish over the Aztecs. And that one element is in Book 12, and that's really the only elements, or Book 12 contains all of the actual, like, personal history of the Aztecs. Most of the rest of the book, the other 2,000 plus pages, is a compendium of religious beliefs, cultural practices, rituals, the cosmology, the organization of their understanding of the universe, basic philosophy, and all of the entirety of the culture is gathered together into this one huge book. And the hello. And Book 12 is reserved largely for the story of their recent history. And it was coming like a generation or so, or the writing of it with Sahagún was coming about a generation or so after the events had happened. So now he's a Christian, a Catholic Christian, writing about indigenous peoples, different languages. He is a Spaniard. He is writing about the natives. He is writing a couple, a generation or so, a couple decades after events that had occurred. There are all of these layers of obscurity between him and what he's actually writing about. And we have to judge that, knowing all of that. We have to read all of that and start to filter through what we can. The bulk of what we have here involves the interaction between the Spanish forces, led primarily by Cortez, in their conquest of the Aztecs, led by the figure Montezuma. And it's an odd little piece to get through. There are a lot of quirks in the writing that when you're reading it, it's like, what's going on there? It can be challenging. It can be difficult. It can be confusing. Can anyone think of a way in which it is unusually written, or confusing, or frustrating? Well, how about repetitious? You very frequently read something and then it says the same thing again.
Everything's fragmented.
Everything is very fragmented. Excellent observation. But the fragments recur often. And when he had heard that what the messengers reported, this is Montezuma, hearing from his people their first impressions of seeing the Spanish. And when he had so heard what the messengers reported, he was terrified, he was astounded, and much did he marvel at their food. He was terrified, okay. He was astounded. Well, isn't that kind of the same thing as terrified? Maybe a little different. And much did he marvel, which is another word essentially for being astounded, at their food, which is also a curious little detail. Well, is that really the takeaway? These people are coming to conquer your civilization and practice some genocide, but you're really just blown off by what they're snacking on? Especially did it cause him to faint away when he heard how the gun at the Spaniard's command discharged the shot, how it resounded as if it thundered when it went off. It indeed bereft one of strength. It cut off one's ears. It shut off one's ears. Yeah, cut off would be different. That's a really close shot. Very good. Thank you for catching me on that. It shut off one's ears. And when it discharged, something like a round pebble came forth from within. We all know, all too tragically, what guns are and what they can do. These people had no idea. And think of, how terrifying that can be when somebody comes over and they have this long stick and they can point it at something. It makes a very loud noise that's quite shocking. And then destruction.
I think that he do something with his ship like don't hold them now. So it's slow like we don't know where to be.
Yeah, that's a famous old story about burning the ships to motivate your men. Yeah, sure.
We don't know where we're going back.
Yeah, that motivates, but it also tends to piss people off. I was really I had a wife and family back home, and you took my ability to get back to them away, and I'm going to remember that. Not necessarily the smart way to go about motivating. But anyway, fire went showering forth, sparks went blazing forth, and its smoke smelled very foul. It had a fetid odor, which verily wounded the head. Again, it smelled and it had an odor. Repetition. Why? I don't know. Lots of speculation on that. There are a lot of scholars who look at the repetition that occurs through this, and many will just say that, well, it creates emphasis. You know, the smell of gunpowder is what they're smelling, and yeah, it's very strong. And if you're just smelling it for the first time, and it's coming in a context where you're very upset or excited to begin with, it's going to be very dramatic. It's going to be very significant. So emphasis comes from that. Can also be a matter of translation. Sometimes just translating from one language to the other, even from Spanish to English, quite frankly. The words and the syntax is a little bit different, and you gotta sometimes repeat the same things, because not every word can be bent the same way in each particular language. And certainly if you're going from a not quite written language like Nahuatl into Spanish, there's going to be some real jiggering that happens. What's that?
There's a translation between those two.
There's a couple of them. It's a the theory of translation studies, I'll go one better on you, that one, is a remarkably fraught endeavor, because there are very few instances in any language from one word to the other where a single word can mean the exact same thing as another word. So whenever you start going in there, it becomes this nightmare of meanings branching out into all directions.
One example is the Bible.
Yeah. Sure. Fortunately, everybody agrees on what the Bible means, and there's never been any fighting about that. Translation, yeah, it says this, but it means this. Come on, it's so simple. I get it. But another aspect of that I will point out is that sometimes the repetitions are not entirely repetitions. They seem to be, but you can also track development. Look at, and when the shot struck a mountain, it was as if it were destroyed, dissolved, and a tree was pulverized. It was as if it vanished. It was as if someone blew it away. Now, again, they're kind of hammering that like, okay, it did a number on the tree. I get it. The emphasis comes across. But there are gradations of difference there. It was destroyed, but also dissolved. Dissolved is kind of different. I see destroyed and I think it blows out. I think dissolved and it kind of collapses in. So there's a difference there. I'm not sure exactly where the text is going with that. I'm going to guess that everybody's going to have their own opinion on that, and that's okay. But there is a subtle difference, and being awake to that difference is kind of the point. And also notice how they're playing with a little something that we English types like to call the subjunctive mood. It was as if something was something else. You see this phrase a lot in this text. It was as if something, where they suddenly go for something abstract. It's not just a thing, it's as if that thing were something else. So these little grammatical maneuvers, these little twists, these little suggestions open up new realms of meaning. I know it's getting a little bit abstract there. I know it's getting a little complicated there.
It sounds like propaganda.
What? How? Propaganda is a big word.
I know, but it's like he's trying to show off how powerful their Spanish guns are.
Who is he?
I don't know.
Okay.
Whoever's writing.
Whoever's writing.
I don't know his name.
Okay. Well, that would be the Spanish monk,
Yeah, that's
or the people he was talking to, who were the natives. Are they
no.
writing this as propaganda for how brutal the Spanish could be, and how violent their culture is, and how much, in general, they smell? Or is this the Spanish voice surfacing and saying that, well, yeah, this is a gun. Everybody has them, we've all got them, but these people are all scared. Isn't that adorable of them?
In this paragraph, it sounds like propaganda.
Okay.
Not the whole thing. Just it.
Propaganda is language that is used to affect a political purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So is rhetoric, by the way. But it's all a matter of who is trying to pull those strings, and whether or not you can see those strings being pulled.
It always comes back to that.
Okay, maybe this is the church. Maybe this is the church. There was here's another aspect of the age of exploration. They weren't just after gold; they were after souls. One of the sparks of the European Renaissance itself, the age of exploration, was, I forget the date, but the fall of Constantinople. The city of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul in Turkey, had been seen as a kind of a way station between Christian Europe and the Muslim North Africa. And all of the crusades throughout the Middle Ages were about trying to take back the Holy Land. And Constantinople, being right between them, was seen as a very important juncture in that fight. Constantinople went decidedly for the Muslim forces and opened up, generations and centuries of rule in that part of the world, effectively sealing off all of that potential conversion. Because one of the great hopes of the Middle Ages was that the Christian warriors of Europe could go and convert all of the Muslim heathens of North Africa and Western Asia. When that was no longer viable, well, they had to go looking elsewhere for heathens. So, we'll just sail over there, and we've got whole civilizations that have never heard of Christ. So we can just make that pitch, and then we'll get in good with God, because God's really big on converting. And he'll forgive us all the slaughtering and the raping and the robbery that we do there if we can just go back to the Pope and say, hey, Pope!
Bless us.
Yes, we signed up a whole bunch of new converts. So that element is in here as well. Another curious element, and again, I'm tiptoeing through this because this is how you pick this stuff out. Another curious element is this kind of primitivism, and again, a little condescension leaking in at how they're so awed by how different things are with the Spanish. And those which bore them upon their backs, their deer were as tall as roof terraces. What are they talking about there? Their deer? Horses! Horses were not in North America or Central America or South America at this point. Yeah. Those were all imports. But the natives don't know what the hell they are. They just look at them and say, well, that looks like a deer to me. They know what a deer is. That's just a really big deer. And we can read that, and yeah, when we realize that, it's sort of funny. Like, oh yeah, big deer. It's cute, isn't it? But by saying that, and by using that term, they're deer, and not saying that, well, you know, they had never, we're not given the context, they had never seen a horse before. Just by including it, it's kind of inviting a little derision, kind of inviting a little condescension, inviting a little, oh, isn't that cute? They don't know what a horse is. So the text is prompting you towards that. And their bodies were everywhere covered. Only their faces appeared. They were wearing clothes. Technically, they were wearing armor because they were soldiers. But this was weird. They were very white. They had chalky faces and had yellow hair, though the hair of some was black. Long was their beards. They also were yellow. They were yellow-bearded. The Negro's hair was kinky. It was curly. This fascination is, again, the way it's presented, it is a documentation of an honest human reaction, I would say, to seeing something different. And the text is trying to transcribe that and trying to record that so that in this study of humanity, other scholars can come along and comb through it and say, well, okay, this is an example of two cultures meeting, and these are the sorts of observations that get made. They're very superficial. They're often kind of idiosyncratic. Again, we've got the reference pretty soon to food. They're just amazed at what they're eating. But there is a possible condescension there, a possible primitivism. Like, you know, though they don't understand what blonde hair is, we all have these long locks. I'm not sure how to take that. They're fascinated with the dogs that they have, and they really dwell on that. And you can see the general character of those first impressions. They're impressed by the animals. They're impressed by the physical peculiarity, by the food, and by the threat that these new people pose. Those dogs look scary. The big deer, who cares? It's just sort of sitting there. Horse isn't dangerous. It's the people on them that are terrible. But the dogs, that's a threat. They recognize what teeth are. We get a really nice portrait of the figure of Montezuma in the chapter about how Montezuma wept. We get an interior view of his thought process, which is really quite extraordinary. We are told when Montezuma had heard thus and inquired about that he was much sought, that the god wished to look upon his face. The gods are the Spanish in this. It was as if, notice those words again, his heart was afflicted, he was afflicted. Again, that repetition, again, that development. It's not just as if his heart was afflicted, he himself was afflicted, but you're also getting an interior sense of the man himself. And maybe this is coming from a first-hand account. Maybe Montezuma walked off stage that day and confided to a chief aide who kept a really good diary, or at least told someone else, who told someone else, who told someone else, and all the way it filtered down to find its way into the report that became this book. But you don't know. So you can't necessarily trust those thoughts. But still, those thoughts of anxiety, those thoughts of fear, we're told he wanted to run, his first impulse. He was supposed to be this fierce warrior, this great emperor of probably the most powerful, or at least one of the most powerful civilizations on the American sphere. And we're told, well, you know, he saw everybody and he panicked. He saw the weapons, he saw the Spanish armor, and he wanted to run. Does that belittle him? Does that humanize him? Do we think more of him for that or less? These are troubling questions. We get a really nice history about the Spanish actually arriving and getting closer to the Aztecs. We learn about how Cortez was quite ingenious in playing off rivals to the Aztecs. Montezuma had a lot of enemies. There were plenty of tribes and other groups who did not much like them. And they all practiced a kind of what would become known as realpolitik. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so with a relatively small force, Cortez was able to conquer a continent by going up to one group and saying, you know, those people over there, they're talking some smack about you. I heard them. And I understand that beef goes back a long way. Well, you know, we've got these here gun things. They're really loud. They're really cool. You've got all of these people. Why don't we get together and we can knock them off? Politically brilliant. Militarily brilliant. Ethically, well, that's a different ranking. And the mayhem that this unleashed. There was thereupon the stabbing, the slaying, the beating of the people. That's a hell of a portrait. What jumps out? They're not talking about movements on a map. They're not talking about, you know, the size of one army as opposed to the other. They're not talking about particular battles. They're not talking about overall military strategy. They're recording and being impressed by the immediate sensation of terror and destruction, mayhem. Montezuma sent emissaries to the Spanish. We see the perspective, and this is all essentially from the Aztec perspective. We see the perspective of them as they first begin to interact with the Spanish. You see the offering of gold, which Montezuma and his men assessed pretty clearly was what they were after. And when they had given them these, they appeared to smile. They were greatly contented, gladdened, as if they were monkeys. They seized upon the gold. It was as if their hearts were satisfied, brightened, calmed. For in truth, they thirsted mightily for gold. They stuffed themselves with it. They starved for it. They lusted for it like pigs. They don't think much of the Spanish, do they? They're characterizing them as animals, greedy for gold. And also, they find their language kind of amusing. And they went about lifting on high the golden banners They were moving them back and forth. They went taking them to themselves. It was as if they babbled. What they said was gibberish. Now, of course, if you're hearing a group of people talking among themselves in a language you don't understand, you can just say, man, it's gibberish. You know, they were speaking Spanish. The perspective on that, however, is significant because it is coming from the native side. Certainly, the Spanish heard the same gibberish, or slightly different gibberish, coming out of the natives. But here we're getting a sense of, oh, okay, that kind of goes both ways. Here, this little excerpt is infantilizing, I would say, the Spanish. They were so dazzled by all the banners and all the glittery gold and, wow, look at it, running around being silly, gibbering to one another. But from a European perspective then, think about what that does. And this is kind of what Montaigne gets at also. If you can take that perspective and realize that they were seeing us as the barbarians here. They were looking at us as the undeveloped nation.
Yeah, so you don't have gold on yourself?
Yeah, hey, we don't know. We got this stuff lying all over the place.
Yeah, we're gonna donate some to you.
Sure. Thomas More's Utopia makes a big joke about that. And so does Voltaire a couple of generations later. But that aspect of saying, well, they're essentially the same looking at us as we are looking at them. That perspective, that relativism, cultural relativism, is a core aspect of humanism, quite frankly. The ability to study humankind and see that, well, there are different ways of going about things. Maybe they have a different value system than we do, but maybe in certain ways it's better. The perspective of these people getting all giddy because they found some shiny metal makes you really start to wonder, well, why do we like gold so much? What is the big thing about gold? That's a stupid thing to base an entire economy on. And once you start that, you can start questioning the way you do just about everything. And it opens up all sorts of possibilities. Is any one culture any better than another? What can we learn from the cultures of others? And by learning from it, are we dealing fairly with them? Is that cultural appropriation? Is that stealing an idea and claiming it's your own? Are we asserting a hierarchy over that and saying, well, they do something one way, we do it another way. And I've thought about it, and yeah, the way we do it is better. Those sorts of conclusions can be awfully troubling. But the process of comparative anthropology, this is what they're doing here, that process is really what matters. That process opens up the possibilities to imagine other ways of doing things, other ways of behaving, other ways of thinking. Without that, you just stay hermetically sealed in your own little world. But in this new era of the early modern period, where we are suddenly able to cross an ocean and circle the entire globe, staying in your own polite little corner isn't really a thing anymore. You have to learn to deal with other people. You have to learn to get along with other people, to engage with ideas that are difficult, that are foreign, that are just weird at first. And maybe your ideas work better for you in certain contexts, but maybe you could steal some ideas and get a little bit of an edge. And if you look at the history of humanity on the planet, real technological development starts in this era. Before that, we were just apes with sticks. But once we can start to engage with people, once we can start to deal with one another and steal ideas, which is a good thing, because we can take that core idea and say, well, all right, that's a good idea, but what if we did it this way? And you tweak it just a little bit, you polish it up just a little bit, and suddenly it's a much better idea in general. Until somebody else steals it from you and does something even more with it. Then you got a right to be pissed. But that process of rational thought, of the exercise of the human mind, and not accepting just, well, that's the way things are for everything, but always trying to push against that and saying, well, why? Why does it have to be that way? Why can't we do it this other way? Why do they have different results than we do if we're doing the same thing? What is the problem? How can we make our lives better? Previous generations in a Vatican-dominated world would say, well, you're not supposed to make your life better. Just forget about here. This is supposed to suck. And then you die, and you move on, and then heaven is great. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. Put your efforts and your attention on the here and now, and you can make this world a hell of a lot better. And that's what's going on in books like this. They are great histories of horrors in many respects, great histories of cultural exchange in other respects. But the bigger picture is this history of human interaction and development that comes out of it. And you can be awfully put off by the terror that is struck again and again and again. You can be heartbroken by the way Montezuma is treated, by his long speech where he talks in a very specific way to the Spaniards, saying, well, okay, all the previous governors have been watching this city and this culture and holding it for you, and you are just essentially the next placeholder in that. It is a continuum, which is what a great leader can do when he knows that he is militarily outgunned. He is fighting for his people to be seen as friendly and not a threat, and trying to find the one pathway forward. Doesn't work out too well for him, but the humanity that comes through that speech. O our Lord, thou hast suffered fatigue, thou hast endured weariness, thou hast come to arrive on earth, thou hast come to govern thy city of Mexico. All the way down to thou hast come. The resignation that settles in there, that sense of humanity, that sense of desperation perhaps, that sense of heroism of somebody trying to save his people. Those little moments, we can see humanity within the text. And that is the value of dealing with these things outside of just dates and facts and history multiple choice questions. When you can see the humanity in somebody who is very different than you, separated by thousands of miles, thousands of years, it makes that distance a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable, and you can start to appreciate what their world was like and how different and similar yours might be. And it's just fun.